Our mission is quite simple and very important. It is to raise both congressional and public awareness about the progress taking place in cancer research and the vital role that research plays in cancer prevention, detection, treatment, and improving the quality of life for all people with cancer, survivors, and those who may be at risk in the future. And we want to thank you all for being here today. And I especially want to thank Mark Smith, who many of you know, who is the executive director of the coalition over here, has done a great job with all of our work. Oh yes, we'll give Mark a the Cancer 101 briefing series, and this briefing today is part of that, has been designed and has been in existence now for a number of years. It's very unique. Its purpose is really to attack a wide range of issues that are important to the current landscape of cancer and to provide all stakeholders, and especially our friends and colleagues on Capitol Hill, with the latest information about cancer research in order to help guide and provide important expertise behind policy decisions that are made in Washington that affect us all. We're thrilled that President Obama dedicated $215 million in his 2016 budget toward a research initiative that is aimed at helping scientists and doctors develop a personalized medicine approach for treating their patients. We're confident that under the leadership of Acting Director Doug Lowy at the National Cancer Institute, the Precision Medicine Initiative there will have a lasting and meaningful impact on its main objectives, which are clinical trials to advance precision medicine, research that will predict who is at greatest risk in developing cancer, identifying personalized cancer treatments based upon the genetic information of each patient, overcoming drug resistance in cancer treatment, and building a knowledge system that will support precision medicine moving forward. We also are extremely grateful to the bipartisan members of Congress that have been working tirelessly to develop the 21st Century Cures Initiative and also the Innovation Initiative, one in the House, one in the Senate. We believe that these proposals represent a novel framework that will advance basic, clinical, and translational biomedical research on cancer and many other important diseases. And we're especially supportive of the establishment of an NIH Innovation Fund to achieve the goals and objectives of the 21st Century Cures Initiative. And we strongly encourage all of the leaders in both the House and the Senate to make sure to include appropriate adequate funding and sustained funding for NIH and the FDA in carrying out their important missions. So today, I'm very excited about the topic for today's briefing. We're going to be focusing on several important research initiatives that are advancing precision-based cancer prevention and detection. We're very pleased, as I said before, to have such a distinguished panel of experts to speak with us today.
I would like to open by thanking Wendy for what a great job she's doing as president of NCCR. It's a job I had for a few years, and I know it takes a lot of time. So, but Mark makes it a pleasure, and it's true. That's true. It makes it a pleasure to serve. I personally recruited him for this job. So I'm here to talk to you today a little more broadly about cancer prevention, because it's only in recent years that cancer prevention has become more laser focused and more, we talk about precision cancer prevention the way we talk about precision medicine. But for many years, cancer prevention was really either population-based or targeted at different demographics, and that's what a lot of the programs of the Prevent Cancer Foundation do. But at the end of the day, we all have the same mission, or we have the mission. We are trying to save lives through cancer prevention and early detection. For 30 years, as of December the 3rd of this year, we will have been the only nonprofit in the cancer world and in any world solely dedicated to cancer prevention and early detection. And we do that by focusing our resources on cancers that can be prevented through lifestyle changes or early detection followed by prompt treatment. I'll give you sort of an overview of the state of cancer right now, and it kind of swings back and forth between good news and bad news. So the good news is we know from research that prevention efforts could save 4.5 million lives and almost $600 billion over the next 25 years. But not so good news is that this year, 1.6 million Americans will hear those dreaded words, "Sorry, you have cancer," and nearly 600,000 will lose their lives to the disease just this year. And the economic cost of cancer in 2009, which is the year that we have the most recent numbers available, was $216 billion. And remember that we can save $600 billion over the next 25 years if we incorporated prevention. So cancer prevention and early detection have come a long way. But let me just depict that 600,000 lives lost annually, break it down a little bit. That's the equivalent of 3 jumbo jets crashing every day and killing, fully loaded, and killing everybody on board, no survivors. That's 1,500 people a day. Thought of another way, it's 9/11 every 2 days. This is really a serious problem. It's urgent, and we don't take it urgently the way we did in our reaction to 9/11. So there is some better news. The population is aging, but the 5-year survival rate for all cancers in the last 40 years has increased from 49% to 68%. And that was in 2009, and we're doing a little better now. And there are actually more than 14 million cancer survivors living today. We know that 50% of cancer incidents and up to 50% of cancer deaths are preventable with what we know right now. So the big challenge is getting people to incorporate what we know into their daily lives, to make those lifestyle choices that will help them reduce their risk of getting cancer or to find it early through the appropriate use of screening. It's important to remember that only 5% of cancers are inherited, a genetic mutation that you're born with. The other 95% happen because of insults to your mutations over the years. We like to talk about break cancer prevention down into 7 steps, and they're simple if you think about it. It's pretty simple. Don't use tobacco in any form. Protect your skin from the sun. Eat a healthy diet. Maintain a healthy weight and be physically active. Practice safe sex and avoid risky behaviors. Get immunized, particularly against HPV and for hepatitis. And know your family history and get regular cancer screenings. And it is important to know your family. This is just an infographic that shows these 7 steps on one handy-dandy card. But what I was going to say, it's really important to know your family medical history because having certain kinds of cancer in your family does put you at higher risk. And even though only 5% of cancers are inherited, it's 5% of a big number. It's 5% of 1.6 million. So if you think about it that way, it's really important to know your family history. So we say that our programs in prevention rest on what we say 4 pillars. And the first pillar is research. We have funded research grants all across the country, 39 states, and in Canada. So we award research grants. We prioritize early career researchers, young investigators with really brilliant ideas who apply to us. We have an NIH-style review process, and we give them relatively small grants, but they are really the seed corn for the next generation of cancer prevention research. I happened to be at an IOM panel this morning and ran into a senior investigator from UCSF, and we were chatting, and she said, "You know, you gave me my first grant." And I said, "Yes, I recognize your name." And she said, "Well, that was the most important one because it kept me in the lab and it kept me in cancer research." So it's always nice to hear those kind of validating comments. Here's some examples of what I would consider precision prevention research. Way back early in her career, we funded Dr. Anna Giuliano for some seminal work on the HPV vaccine. We funded Dr. Andy Dannenberg for some of his work on COX-2 inhibitors as chemopreventive agents. And in fact, one COX-2 inhibitor, celecoxib, has a cancer prevention indication. And you're going to hear more about some of the awesome work that Andy's doing right now, but you're going to hear about it from another one of the speakers. So I'm not going to spoil his fun that he gets to tell you about it. And finally, Dr. Craig Jordan, who most people have heard of, who he took a failed contraceptive called tamoxifen and turned it into a drug that maybe has saved more lives than any one single drug there is. It prevents primary breast cancer and also contralateral breast cancer in breast cancer survivors. Our second pillar is education, and we try to educate people so that they understand the value of cancer screening and healthy lifestyles. We are encouraging them to take charge of their own health. And when we target our education programs to certain demographics, certain age groups, and that way we are making them a little more precise. So here's one. It's a breast health education program for young women so that they can learn and go home and teach their elders about breast health. We target elementary school-age children with a very innovative, at the time, 1995, video game to teach them about making healthy choices when it comes to nutrition and physical activity. And sadly, this game is no longer published because it was really ahead of its time. Nobody was talking about childhood obesity as such a serious challenge in 1995. About 15 years ago, we developed the SuperColon, and it was the first. There are many of them out there now, but it was the first giant inflatable colon that you can walk through and find out about risk factors and symptoms of colorectal cancer and what colorectal cancer actually looks like, and other diseases of the colon as well. In 2014, we introduced a campaign targeted at millennials called Check Your Mate. And it's a little edgier than what we usually do, but it has gotten a lot of attention. Our website crashed when it first went up on Valentine's Day of 2014, and it spent 3 months on one of those jumbotrons in Times Square just this past summer. And our final new campaign is called Think About the Link, and this is a campaign that will target primary care providers as well as certain demographics with information about the links between HPV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and cancer prevention. The diseases that are caused by these viruses are preventable cancers, and that's the message we're trying to get across. Now, despite our very best efforts, sometimes our messaging falls on deaf ears, and I'd like to give you an example who I think everybody will recognize, and this is what he said. I do not like broccoli, and I haven't liked it since I was a little kid, and my mother used to make me eat it. And I'm President of the United States, and I'm not going to eat any more broccoli, except he pronounced it broccoli. So, Mr. President, I don't think you still do eat broccoli. The third pillar that we rest on is community outreach. So we believe in taking cancer prevention and early detection to the community. And we have a lot of programs targeting large demographics, African Americans and Hispanics, but we also focus on American Indian and Alaska Natives, as well as rural communities. So what you're seeing now are just some of our programs in action. This is one we do for Latinas, and this was a group of Native Americans that we brought together for a weekend to talk about what they could do to promote colorectal cancer screening. And finally, we believe in taking this out into the community in our own backyard. So twice we have given a grant to the George Washington University Medical Center to purchase a mobile mammography unit, both in 1995 and in 2005. And it's been going all over the district for the last 20 years, saving lives of people who can't afford to get a mammogram or can't afford treatment if they are diagnosed. And then the final pillar that we rest on is advocacy. Our foundation advocates for policies and regulations. The regulators are almost as important as what goes on in these other buildings at the federal and state levels that support our priorities. And here are our priorities: cancer research, prevention, early detection, innovation. We can't lose sight of the fact that innovation is what drives science and development of new products that help people. Health equity is a really important issue to us, as well as access to both screening and treatment. And finally, quality care. Even though we aren't really a patient organization, we do believe that every patient should get quality cancer care, and so we speak up when there's a chance to make our voices heard. And if anybody is interested in a how-to guide to advocacy, we have a really handy toolkit that's on our website and can be downloaded, and I was not involved in its development, so I can praise it. It is really a nice piece of work that our policy and advocacy director and her colleagues put together about a year ago. And now that my slides are moving, I'm going to stop and say thank you very much for your attention.
Honored to be here to address the distinguished audience, especially our young policymakers that would be executing or implementing precision medicine in the future. And therefore, I'm very delighted to share our experience through a program called EDRN, Early Detection Research Network, sponsored by the National Cancer Institute. I also like to acknowledge at the outset my colleagues from NCI, Holly, Martina, and Richard, and of course, my partner in the entire journey, Mr. Crichton, who is Dan Crichton from JPL, who will be speaking during my talk. And especially I wanted to acknowledge because JPL is known for rocket launch, not for doing biomedical sciences. 15 years ago, when I was visiting JPL, I found him that he's very interested in expanding his expertise, and especially at no cost. So that was very attractive to us to help us build a strong informatic infrastructure for EDRN. So having said this, let me tell you what I intend to do this afternoon. Hopefully, by the end of my talk, I would be able to convince you that to implement precision medicine or precision early detection and prevention, you need a team science, what I call it takes a village.
Just to let you all know while we're working on this, there are some seats up here, those of you standing in the back, if you want to sit.
It's not moving.
It's moving here.
But it's not, okay, so then I'll have to move. I'm sorry. But there's one slide that is skipped. That's a very important slide that I really want to go up. Somehow I don't know. Anyway, I'll use this. So many of you have already heard Dr. Doug Lowy, his definition of precision medicine. And basically the NCI mission is to help people live longer, healthier life by supporting research to reduce the incidence of cancer and to improve the outlook for patients who develop cancer. So how can we save more lives? Well, it's very obvious that if we can detect cancer at the earliest stages, then we'll have better treatment and better effect afterward. So in order for us to do this, we need to detect cancer at the earliest stages. As you know that most of the cancers are detected when they are 1 to 4 centimeters in size, and by this time, they have already metastasized. Therefore, we need methods or biomarkers that are effective in detecting cancer at the earliest stage, also estimating the risk of impending cancer, and also guiding us to a better treatment or therapy. So what are the biomarkers? Many of you must have heard biomarkers. So biomarker, just the definition of biomarkers is any characteristic that is objectively measured and evaluated as an indicator of normal biological processes, pathogenic processes, or pharmacological response. So in a simplistic term, biomarkers could be circulating DNA, could be circulating exosome, could be circulating proteins, and so on. So these are the biomarkers. For example, PSA. PSA is considered a biomarker for prostate cancer. CA-125 considered for ovarian cancer. And these are all proteins. So in terms of precision medicine, where does the biomarkers play a role in, oh, this moving here but not there.
So I just want to let everybody know all the slides are in the blue.
Marker fit into the larger scheme of, I will say, precision health or precision medicine. As you can focus here, that one of the earliest event or process is early detection or diagnosis by measuring biomarkers or features that you'll be hearing, like imaging features. You'll be speaking from one of our speakers. So this is an earliest event in a grand scheme of precision medicine. So why early detection? So if you look into this slide, this is the slide for 4 major tumors: colon cancer, lung, breast, and prostate. So when the tumors are localized, for example, colon cancer, 41% are localized by the current available screening devices, then you have a 5-year survival of 64%. What if you have a better technology, a biomarker that could detect colon cancer at almost about 90% or more at the localized stage? As you can see that the 5-year survival improves from 54 to 90%, and lung, for example, 16 to 49%. So the message I want to convey is that earlier, the better, and improved survival. Going to the next one, so what's the state of the science in biomarker research? If you look, follow the literature, more than 40,000 papers are published each year, and among those 40,000, 4,000 to 5,000 are on biomarkers for early detection, diagnosis, or prognosis, and almost all of them, they claim 90% sensitivity and specificity, but very few make it to clinical application. Why? The reason being is that they all lack rigorous standards for validating the clinical relevance in appropriate population. This is one of the major hurdles in biomarker research, that we keep publishing papers but not able to translate them for clinical application. So the cancer biomarkers, why is so? Why we are missing the mark? The reasons are many, and I'm not going to read them. You can read them. But two things I wanted to really focus on. One is the biology of early disease, and the second one is need for more collaboration. Most of the research had been conducted through single lab, not really collaborating on various aspects of early detection. For example, accrual samples, good samples, defining the clinical questions, analyzing the data, using appropriate statistical expertise, and so on. So this is very important that we have a village, we have a team science approach to solving the early detection issue. So why is discovery of clinically useful biomarker difficult? As I said earlier, it's the biology. The reason being is that most of the biology we know, this is an analogy with the iceberg, that we really know from the tip of the iceberg. Big chunk of iceberg is still unknown. So we need to focus more on studying the earliest event in evolving tumors. Also, we need to have collaboration among stakeholders, basic scientists, clinicians, public health professionals, informaticians, and bioinformaticians, advocates, funding organizations, and regulatory authorities. So the need are the following. We need to develop non-invasive, highly sensitive and specific biomarkers that should be clinically driven, not just for the sake of discovery. It should have rigor and also demonstration of reproducibility, and also should be conducted, if possible, through team science. And of course, all stakeholders in the process should be empowered to come up with new ideas. So EDIAN is one of the many programs. This is a program that NCI has sponsored, is answering some of those needs with a team science approach. So if you look on your right-hand side of your slide, it's an EDIAN organization that says we have, it's like a hub and spokes model, and here is the hub and spoke model. So you have three major components: biomarker developmental labs, biomarkers reference lab, and also clinical validation center. This is based on the premise that a person cannot be a judge and at the same time be the prosecutor, meaning that if you have a biomarker you discovered, let someone independently validate this, verify it. So once the biomarkers in EDIAN is discovered through developmental labs, they are handed over to our biomarkers reference lab, and then it goes to clinical validation center. These are the clinicians who have experience in accruing patients for a big, large trial. So as you can see here that the process is working extremely well, and I'll show you some outcomes after my colleague, Dr. Crichton, speaks about. But moving on, so what had been the objectives and what are the objectives for the EDRN? The very important objective is to standardize biomarker validation criteria and bring biomarkers to clinical use. So as I said earlier, it really takes a village. We have a number of partnerships with many federal agencies. Most notably, we have Jet Propulsion here, sitting here. We have DOD, we have DOE, and also NIST, which help us in terms of measuring the rigor and reproducibility for biomarker diagnostic assay. We have nonprofit foundations who have contributed in kind. For example, Canary Canary Foundation of California, Lush Garden. I understand that Lush Garden is one of the sponsors, and I want to really acknowledge them that they have helped us as well. The whole idea is to do the pre-competitive data sharing with all our stakeholders so that we do not make the same mistakes if the others have done the same. And of course, many of international partners are copying or emulating EDRN experience. Two being China. China has already created China EDRN, and Europe is trying to create one based on the EDRN model. So meeting the goals, provide integrated infrastructure, build resources for biomarker research, and of course, as I said earlier, that also ensure that the biomarker research is reproducible. So the very outset of our EDRN, we set the guidelines. So this is our famous 5 phases criteria for biomarker discovery and validation, which has been highly cited, more than 300 plus citation for this. And actually, if you say phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, 5, this is, I learned from JPL when they launched the rocket, they have some sort of verification checklist. And I thought that perhaps we can do also for biomarkers, and basically, these are the checklists. So when a biomarker moves from phase 1 to phase 2, the statistical rigor and support for clinical use is strengthened. And then it moves to 3, is further strengthened, then move to 4, and move to 5. And then this was further expanded to include the types of sample that would be used for biomarker validation by our probe design, which has been very highly cited by investigators outside EDRN. Moving on, so now that we have established a vertical integrated infrastructure, meaning that there's a handoff between each among components. And of course, and then this really has been very useful in making credible biomarker assay and clinical application. So of course, the other responsibility of EDRN is to build infrastructure for others to use, not just within EDRN, for people from outside EDRN. And we have a number of those clinical samples that people can request. We have reference samples that people can request, and they're all stored in NCI Frederick. So all things have been possible for one reason, that JPL has provided us the means to collaborate, communicate, and disseminate our findings to our stakeholders. So at this point, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dan Crichton.
Thank you, Sudhir. So I think it's probably a surprise you see somebody from NASA sitting in a cancer research discussion, but the value really here is that if you look at what we do when we launch spacecraft and we observe the deep edges of our solar system, we're bringing back data. And we're trying to put that data together, and we're trying to figure out how to extract meaning from that data, much in the same way that when we began this partnership with EDRN is trying to do with cancer biomarker research. It became a very novel thought to say, can we actually put together the technologies we use for observing space science with those to support biomarker research? And at the beginning of this journey, Sudhir and I began to look at what are some of the key objectives in thinking about informatics, building and enabling infrastructure for collaboration, sharing, and dissemination, developing a structured collection. How do we actually structure our data, and how do we make it searchable and informative, and how do we put it into not only separate silos around the country of what's happening, but how do we actually integrate together to increase the whole study power associated with doing data analysis, because now all of a sudden we've got a major national database for actually supporting cancer research. And so that was the goal, and we actually have constructed now what we call a knowledge system. So it's not just a database, it's really something that's capturing the research of record for cancer biomarker research, all leveraging technologies that we developed at JPL and NASA. And if you look, there's a number of technologies we can leverage. The national data sharing infrastructures. We've got the same challenges in space science with databases all over the country. How do we actually get our scientists to construct and share their data to increase the usability of all this information? How do we better define it? How do we build you heard the word big data, how do we build the infrastructure to scale to support the computing needs we need to do now in science research? How do we build the analysis pipeline so that we can predict and produce high-quality scientific data results using computational computer science, data science kinds of methods that goes through? And how do you begin to develop intelligent algorithms, an artifact of artificial intelligence that can go in and find those needle in a haystack patterns in the data, and how do we visualize and present that in a meaningful way to our science community? So this just shows going from the capture, the generation data through the capture data and integrating that together. So we're talking about trying to take all the laboratory data, put it together in a structured manner, and be able to integrate that into a national platform to create that village, and I call it a virtual village that Sudhir is talking about. And so what's happening is you've got data now coming from many different sources. We've got biomarker data, we've got annotations of that information, we've got various studies occurring, we've got specimens, and we're linking it all together. Think about a World Wide Web of all this biomarker data. You go to Facebook, you've got all these links. You go now to the Eating portal, you got all this links to this value-added research that's going on, that's capturing what's happening in cancer biomarker research so that we can actually serve the entire research community and support what's happening in early detection. And so what's emerged is this now national infrastructure which spans the Eating Insights, which brings together the data, which serves as a platform for now future investigation, discovery, and validation in cancer biomarkers. And not only are we connecting EDRN's data together, we're actually now reaching out and starting to connect data from other databases and other sources to serve as this virtual village for cancer biomarker research. Thanks, Sudhir.
Thank you, Dan. So I will just wrap up by giving you some progress we have made using our team science approach. So let's see. So over the years, almost about 15 years we started, we have about 11 CLIA certified diagnostic tests. They all work as either as a reflex test or as a primary screening test. And these need to be further validated for them to be really applied in clinical setting, but not have any so-called early detection or what we call reflex test for early stage of the disease. So for example, PCA, I'll give you two highlights, PCA3 and OVA1. So PCA3 is a non-coding RNA, and it helps physicians to determine the need for repeat prostate biopsy in men who have had previous negative biopsy. And this was approved by FDA in 2012. The second is the first in vitro diagnostic multivariate index assay. So someone has CA125 high and also the pelvic mass, then the decision is to be made whether to do biopsy or not do biopsy. This panel of biomarkers could help make that decision. So having said this, and in the context of health economics, and how does the entire story of biomarkers fit? Remember, I'm speaking just on the early stage disease, but they're biomarker prognostic markers, they are predictive markers. All things considered, the biomarkers could really have profound impact on health economics. For example, each year we have 7.5 million people being screened colonoscopy, an average cost about $1,600. And then if there's a biomarker that could trigger colonoscopy rather than going to colonoscopy as a first screening test, then that could still save you $1 billion or more. Similarly, as you know that helical CT screening trial yielded an important findings that it reduces mortality by 20%. But at the same time, there are a number of indeterminate nodules, more than 600,000 indeterminate nodules of 8 to 30 millimeter size. And this is like a pathological dilemma in a sense that what to do with them. So in order for us to make a clinical decision, if you can come up with a biomarker that could help us, that will really save us also in terms of the precious fund. For example, if a biomarker, out of those 600, on average, 1/3 are cancer and 2/3 are benign. So what if you have a biomarker that can distinguish benign for cancer and therefore saves precious money? So the cost of, for example, the cost of related diagnostic work is about $9 billion. So even if you have 1/3 reduction in unnecessary diagnostic workup, will save us enormous amount. So in conclusion, I'd simply like to say that biomarkers will have a profound role and implications for precision health, precision medicine by providing precise target for what we call precision prevention and precision treatment. So with this, I'll stop, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I always love getting to give this talk right after you've eaten, because not only is it, I hope, informative, but it also induces remorse and regret on the part of the audience.
Hot dogs.
Yeah, hot dogs, yeah. So really what I want to share with you is one example of a prevention opportunity that can be made more precise if we're able to leverage the kinds of insights and advances that you've already heard about, and if we can gain the resources needed to make this happen. So this is all I'm going to tell you, actually. And after this slide, if you want to zone out or do email for a minute, you won't miss anything. Obesity is a risk factor for cancer. Only 10% of the general public, when recently surveyed, knows this. This is an important issue for you who have influence on policy and regulatory affairs, because obesity will replace tobacco as the leading modifiable risk factor for cancer in the next few years, thanks to our progressive and successful tobacco control projects. Obesity is generally associated with a low-grade inflammatory state. That's the molecular biology of why obesity is probably a risk factor for at least some kinds of cancer. It's also associated with a hidden medical problem that internists know about, the metabolic syndrome, which is an association of abdominal obesity, hypertension, glucose intolerance, prediabetes, and so forth. I'll touch on that. And it bleeds over out of the phenotypically obese group. So what I mean by that is just measuring somebody's height and weight gives you a first approximation of their risk for this, but it neither identifies all cases of it, nor is every person who's obese going to be at risk. So that's where the opportunity for precision biomarkers will become, I hope, clear. And that's what I mean by some phenotypically normal body mass index individuals will have this pathophysiology. Along the cascade that I'll quickly show you, there are many opportunities for intervention, but it is not possible, I don't believe, to intervene at the level of 200 or 300 million adult Americans in the decades ahead. We need precision guidance in order to make this work, and that is our key challenge. Before I go further, because I don't want to forget this, think for just a second about how many of you in the room, you're young, but I bet there are some people on statins or antihypertensives. I want to remind you that when you take those two classes of drugs, you're not taking them, generally speaking, to treat the actual disease, heart attacks and strokes. You're taking them to treat a validated early surrogate, one that not only is an indication of risk, but one that can change in the short term to indicate a long-term benefit. We have not yet been able to establish those clearly, at least not in this area of cancer research, and that is our key fundamental target. When we talk about risk factors for cancer, we have to divide them into those you can do something about, i.e. those that are modifiable, and those that are not. I can't change my genetic gender. I am aging each year, and I've inherited a set of genes from my family. So those are unmodifiable risk factors for cancer. You heard a little bit about this earlier from Bo. On the other hand, the modifiable risk factors are those things we can do something about, tobacco representing the most obvious one, but other behaviors like sun exposure, other toxin exposures, and so forth. And probably the modern era gets its start roughly around 1957 to 62, when the English and then the Americans published for the first time the clear association between tobacco use and cancer. Added to that list, of course, is obesity, as I've already said. And in fact, because we're down around 9% of young adults and adults now smoking, I think I have that number right, something else, of course, statistically will replace tobacco as the leading modifiable risk factor, and that is quietly obesity. My area of research is breast cancer, and that intersected with Dr. Dannenberg, who you saw his picture moments ago, about 12 years ago, when he was studying COX-2 inhibitors, pain medications for inflammation, as a way of possibly preventing some kinds of cancer. But in the case of breast cancer, what we've known for years is that obesity and overweight are associated with an elevated risk, and it's very linear. This slide shows you that after menopause, with each 10-point rise in your body mass index, each decile, 10% rise, there is an increasing risk of developing the disease. Okay, but it's not just breast cancer. In fact, many cancers, even many that you don't think of as associated with obesity, are in fact associated in that way. And not only is the risk of getting them higher, but the outcome after diagnosis is worse. The classic that all physicians learn about is uterine cancer, where you can see there's a 6-fold increase in the risk of uterine cancer among those who are obese. But others that people don't tend to think about, pancreas cancer, between 2- and 3-fold increase in risk, gallbladder cancer. In fact, many of the GI cancers are more common among the obese. Again, this runs at odds to people's perceptions of cancer being associated with weight loss. In fact, weight gain and obesity are risk factors. Why am I so revved up about this? It's because we have a leading wave of a gigantic public health crisis coming our way. You've probably seen these slides already because they're very well traveled. They're from the CDC. And what they show you is something that should actually make your jaw drop. This is the percentage of adults in various body mass index categories by decade and by state. So if you look starting with 1990, you see that up to 10% of the residents of most states and between 10 and 14% of the darker ones were in the obese category. That means a body mass index of 31 or above. But look at 2000. Now there's all that yellow. At that point, 20 to 24% of the citizens of those states were in that highest weight category. Go to 2010, you see this deep red area in the bottom. More than 30% of the citizens of those states are now in that category. I want to be clear, this is not business as usual. This is an unprecedented change in the shape and form of our citizens. This has not happened before. And what's worse is that it's going to get worse. This is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation prediction for 2030, which is just 15 years from now. And what you see in the Deep South is that 2/3 of the citizens will be obese, defined as a body mass index above 31, and in fact, there'll be no state left where there are fewer than 40% of the citizens in that category. I want to be very clear about this. I'm not blaming anybody. There are deep-seated policy reasons, I think, for this unfolding this way, but it is going to have profound repercussions on the shape and form of our health care system in the years to come. I'm here to talk about cancer and narrowly breast cancer, but this is a diabetes problem, this is a hypertension problem, this is a knee replacement problem from osteoarthritis, on and on and on. There is no upside to this whatsoever, and it's real. Not only that, it's not fairly distributed. If you look at each of the states in terms of obesity in 2014, you see that this is a healthcare disparities problem with lower socioeconomic groups bearing an increased proportion of the burden for obesity. Look, I live and work in New York City. The rates of morbid obesity are 14% on the Upper East and West sides of Manhattan, and as you spread out from that high-income area, the rates of obesity go up in a linear fashion. We see that play out across the country as well. So there is going to be an increased burden of this on the people least able to afford it. It is not unique to the United States, although it may be a bit worse. In fact, obesity is the fastest growing health problem in Africa and Southeast Asia, and there's no part of the world that is being spared this increased risk of obesity. What these plots show you over time is that while the average weight of men and women in blue and red is going up, it's also going up in both high-income countries called developed tier and in developing countries. So this is a universal problem, and the solutions may in fact be universal as well. So what I hope I've convinced you of in this first part is that this is a brave new world for us. Unprecedented rates of obesity with deep scientific implications that we need to consider, broad public health implications, and our initial approach to this is to say that this is an energy balance problem and we need to constrain the energy balance, or at least the intake side of this, increase the burn side, that's exercise, to do something productive about this. We have to tip the scales, as it were, back to a favorable direction. Now, there are many scientific explanations for this, and I'm not going to overwhelm you with this, I promise. I just want to remind you that scientifically there's a tremendous amount of work taking place, and these pathways will provide us with both targets and potential markers of risk and success. There is direct production of estrogens in obese individuals from their adipocytes. Those are the fat cells. There is an insulin and glucose story, because as you have high levels of circulating insulin and increased glucose, that's part of what's frequently seen in the metabolic syndrome. So those people are going to have revved up cells. I'm overly simplifying perhaps, but that's a simple concept, and that's something that we can target. And then there are these inflammatory mediators which are produced by the cells that are in the fat of people who are obese. And I want to show you that very specifically. All of this can contribute to the development of and progression of cancer. So we've been asking in the lab and in the clinic this question: is postmenopausal breast cancer a consequence of inflammation that is generated by being obese? Because if it is, inflammation we can begin to target and measure. In a pivotal study about 10 years ago or 8 years ago with Andy Dannenberg, he was planning an experiment of low and high fat diets, and I asked the question as the clinician, when do these mice develop menopause? How many people in the room know when mice go through menopause? They don't. So you have to take their ovaries out to simulate a woman's menopause. So that gives us 4 groups, 2 low-fat groups, 1 with ovaries, 1 without, and a high-fat group, 1 with ovaries, 1 without. That's the experiment. First of all, anybody who goes to clinic like I do and sees 50 to 60-year-old women, a common complaint is, I gain weight, I gained it at menopause, I can't seem to lose it. That's what our mice did. The 2 left bars are the low-fat mice, and they weigh a little more without ovaries. The 2 right bars are the high-fat diet mice. They weigh a little more without ovaries. It suggests that the ovaries themselves in the premenopausal state are providing some protection, and when we lose the ovaries, we have a metabolic change at some level, which I'm not going to go into now, that may support a little bit of weight gain. But more profoundly, in these mice, in their fat, we saw this lesion shown in panel B. This is a dead or dying fat cell surrounded by the cells that devour it, called macrophages, big eaters, macrophages. And they are secreting inflammatory chemicals, which turn out to be critical to this story. We measured them, and you can see on the body, the high-fat mice without ovaries, which is the right-hand group over here. Well, I can't point. But anyway, they were the ones that had it. So we thought we were so brilliant, and we weren't, because the diabetes and endocrinology people had seen this lesion in the fat of people in the abdominal walls 10 years before. This is a cartoon representation of it. It's called a crown-like structure, and that's because the pathologist thought it looked like the crown that you wear on your head. But what it consists of is a dead or dying fat cell and the cells that eat it up and secrete all these inflammatory chemicals. So we asked a simple question: is this lesion that we saw in the mice also present in the patients that we treat? We took 30 patients who were having risk-reducing mastectomies. These were people who had high risk for breast cancer, didn't have the disease, were having mastectomies so we could look at their fat. And in the fat of the breast, on the left, we saw the lesion. On the right, we see it more clearly with a special stain. But this was the disturbing panel on the bottom. The normal weight women, only 1 in 12 had the lesion, and as they went into the overweight or obese category, most of them did. So we were beginning to get clear evidence that obesity in patients would be associated with this inflammatory hotspot, this crown-like structure. So this gives us some important opportunities to think about. How do we roll out an effective and durable calorie restriction across the whole population? The answer to me is we probably can't. What we need to do is find people who are especially at risk. We need to have an intervention, and we need to show them the positive reinforcement that the intervention works. That's, again, the statin and blood pressure analogies that I mentioned a few minutes ago. That's the precision biomarker challenge for us right now. It's really where I think we have to end up. Once we have that, we can more precisely look at diet or nutraceuticals. We've been studying them in small groups of patients, but it's hard to say much about their applicability yet. Lee Jones in our group is actually looking at exercise the same way we're used to looking at drugs. That is, not 30 minutes in the gym 3 times a week for everybody, one size fits all, but the individual patients with different pathophysiologies benefit from different and specific exercise programs. Hard to scale, easier if we develop precision biomarkers for this. And of course, there may be a role for conventional targeted therapies in the future. The American Society of Clinical Oncology, which I was president of 2 years ago, has taken this on in the context of cancer prevention and treatment as well. We aim to increase providers and patients' knowledge about the association. That's an important first step. We want to develop evidence-based recommendations. That's hard to do when you don't have a big body of evidence yet to rely on and you have high standards. We want to support obesity and cancer research and maintain and enhance access to treatment services for these patients. This was published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology last year by Jennifer Ligabell as a position paper. So that's the beginnings of an opportunity in precision prevention, I think, and I thank you again for letting me present that. Thanks.
Cancer Institute to study screening. And one of the first things that we did when we got together as a network is to try to understand what is screening, what is the barrier of what we're studying that we call screening. And we developed what we thought was a good model to think about screening as a process as opposed to a single event. You know, it starts with screening awareness, trying to figure out what the risk for cancer is, whether or not screening is right for you, decision-making around screening. then a test, which is typically the detection test to detect whether there's an abnormality, whether there's need for other tests or tissue diagnosis, and then we extend it into treatment and survivorship. And one of the reasons is that screening delivers a group of tumors that are a little bit different than tumors that will present clinically. These are the earliest forms of tumors, tumors that may not necessarily need to be treated as aggressively as the most aggressive tumors that present clinically. And to think about how we create the interface between screening and treatment is important if we're going to be successful at precision screening. So let's think a little bit about breast cancer screening and think about it in the context of that model. Breast density is important in several aspects of thinking about screening for mammography. One is it's an independent risk factor for cancer, and in thinking about a woman's risk, breast density is something to take into account. And so, for example, this is a relatively less dense breast, and this is a relatively more dense breast. The higher the density, the higher the risk of cancer. Another problem that breast density raises is it masks the ability of mammography to find cancer. So the ability of mammography to be an effective screening test is decreased by increased radiographic breast density. So we think a little bit about how we use that kind of information, that and other risk determinants. We have a number of risk determinants for breast cancer, and we can already start to see that we have a number of tools that we can start to think about. There aren't good guidelines along all these pathways, but we start to think about pathways that we can use to more precisely screen for breast cancer, from a normal risk woman undergoing standard mammography to someone who's got increased breast density. There's starting to be suggestions and data out there that 3D mammography that you may have heard of, or digital breast tomosynthesis, might be a strong solution. For those in the higher breast density categories who have more moderate risk, not quite what we would call high risk, but higher than average risk, there are laws on the books in many states requiring density notification, some of which suggest other screening methods, such as screening ultrasound. And I have this ABMRI here, and I'll tell you what that is in a second. And then, of course, the highest risk women, those that are BRCA1, BRCA2, being offered the most sensitive screening, which is an MRI screening because of their high risk. So let's take a little bit look into this particular area and whether we can have an impact on what we do there. If we look at screening approaches for women with radiographically dense breasts, we did a study in the cooperative group system under ECOG Akron 6666, where we managed to get a look at multiple different methods to screen this population. And we look at the sensitivity for mammography in this population, 31%. Adding ultrasound, which is what most people do in that moderate risk and high density area, you do increase it and pick up additional cancers, but MRI, almost twice the number of cancers detected, twice the sensitivity. And so the problem is that to be able to offer MRI as a screening test across a large population could be cost prohibitive. So what can we do about that? So one of the things we can try to do is to see if we reduce the length of the MR scan to try to make it, if you will, an MR scan light. Can we reduce the cost so it can be cost competitive with ultrasound? And the answer is yeah, we can. This blue bar is a marker of the events during an MRI scan. This is a standard MR scan done for breast cancer. This would be done in the highest risk patients. This is an abbreviated exam, and this is a example of an abbreviated exam with a breast cancer detected. If one of my colleagues in Germany, Christiane Kuhl, looked at an abbreviated MR exam and found that you get about 90% of the cancers that you'll get in a full-blown exam. So based on this data in the cooperative group system under ECOG Akron, we're about to launch a protocol to study this abbreviated MR exam in this population, so this could be offered to further enhance the ability to get precision screening to women. I think there's another important characteristic that we have to study when we think about precision screening, and that is that the decision-making, even with just 4 pathways, is very complex. And how do we empower the primary care physicians and women to have the discussions that they need so they can get to the appropriate decision-making? I don't think we want to underestimate the importance of being able to empower that decision-making and developing tools and education tools to help that go forward. We're also working hard in trying to improve test performance. And one of the things that we find in imaging is although we know that genetics are an important component of biology, genetics work with the environment to ultimately give us the phenotype. And in imaging, we are studying part of the phenotype of nodules, if you will, by being able to look at their shape and their structure and characteristics of them. And one of the things that we typically have done in radiology is we've described them with prose. And more recently, we've started to be able to take computers and extract these features and in quantitative ways describe the phenotype of these objects and be able to use these phenotype descriptions much the way we use genetic codes. At the same time, we tend to, this is some work done by Avi Spira at Boston University. We know that we can also look at background tissue and biomarkers from background tissue as a risk factor for cancer. And this is, we're looking at lung cancer, and we can look at respiratory epithelium, and the background genetic changes in respiratory epithelium are a risk factor for cancer. So the one thing that we're working on is trying to integrate both the imaging phenotypes and the biomarkers from the respiratory epithelium. This is funded off of the DoD Medical Research Program to see if we can improve our ability to reduce the false positives in lung cancer screening. There's another way we can use biomarkers and imaging together. We heard about the EDRN. They're working very diligently and making great progress at developing biomarkers that we could pull out of the serum and be able to predict the presence of a cancer within a patient. Not only that, but they may tell us a lot about what kind of cancer we're looking for, precisely what is the cancer we're looking for. At that point, we can create radio-labeled ligands to find the particular type of cancer we're looking for. So if you imagine you've got a series of biomarkers that you're looking for, you find that this is the light blue biomarker that showed up. We can take a radio tracer that's labeled for the light blue biomarker, put it in, and precisely look for the tumor that the biomarker is pointing for. And so this is an example. Progesterone receptor is a common surface receptor on breast cancer. We have a ligand that targets progesterone receptor. If you can imagine, if we picked up something in a biomarker in the serum that suggested there's a progesterone receptor expressing cancer in that patient, we can specifically look just for that cancer. This is a cancer that's not PR positive. This is a cancer that's progesterone receptor positive, and we can pick that up. There are ligands being made for HER2, for many of the kinds of receptors that may be detected in some of the biomarkers that are being developed. I want to finish talking about an issue that's very, very significant and impacts what we think about screening, and that's overdiagnosis, or in some concept over therapy. I talked about the fact that we're looking at the earliest cancers with screening. And one of the concerns is that we're treating these early cancers very aggressively, mainly because we have trouble knowing which of the early cancers is not going to progress and not going to have biology that's going to be very aggressive, and which are. There's another issue that's at play here, and that's that these tumors are heterogeneous. And when we get biopsies or we even get excisions of a part of a tumor, we don't necessarily know the entire biology that's in the patient. And there's nowhere where that's more common than in prostate cancer. In prostate cancer, screening has gotten very controversial. Most people would agree that if you had a cancer that's the size of half a cc, that has a grade level of 7 or greater, you probably ought to be treated. If you have less than that, then many men are choosing watchful waiting. The problem is that the spatial heterogeneity of prostate cancer within the patient is significant, and at least 30% of men that have a biopsy with less than grade 7, when you take their prostate out, actually have grade 7 or more. So the question is, how can we go forward and try to figure out what is the right tissue to sample? In prostate in particular, the use of MRI is getting a lot of attention. And this is a patient who had a biopsy that was, this 3+3 is the Gleason score was 6 on the left side. And what you can see in this MRI scan, these are multiple different scans, with this diffusion scan being the most sensitive. And you can clearly see this large lesion on the right side, which was a high grade, a Gleason score 8 lesion on the right side. So because of the sampling error, they just got the wrong part of the tumor, the wrong part of the patient. This patient may have gone on into a active surveillance category, but with a MRI scan identifying the proper area to sample, they would go on to treatment. And being able to offer this as an opportunity is a way to make people more comfortable with the idea of active surveillance and reduce the impact of overdiagnosis and overtherapy. We're playing the same kind of game, if you will, with breast cancer. We did a study in ECOG looking at molecular determinants for the earliest kinds of breast cancer, carcinoma in situ, or DCIS, to see if we can predict the DCIS outcomes. And so when doing a study of excision alone for DCIS, we developed a molecular score where we had some patients that had a higher risk of recurrence than other patients with excision alone. But even patients in the low score, which frankly were the majority of patients with DCIS, still had over a 10% recurrence at 10 years, and many of those were invasive recurrence. And the problem is that the molecular marker predicting biology incorrectly, or was that there was heterogeneous disease in the breast? And so this is an example of a breast MR of a patient who presented with microcalcifications, was diagnosed with DCIS for this lesion here. Elsewhere in the breast, they had a small invasive cancer that was not detected and not visible mammographically. And so we're now combining the MR scan to see, is there another lesion somewhere in the breast that would reduce the efficacy of excision alone so that we can better offer minimal therapy for minimal disease appropriately by making sure we're studying the whole breast and have the true extent of disease. So I think in conclusion, if we look at the screening process as a entire process from front to back, we have a lot of opportunities to influence that process and create personalized solutions. Imaging, I think, has an important role in multiple components of that process. I think we're already starting to see precision screening a reality. It takes a lot of collaboration between folks studying biomarkers, people studying imaging, and those treating cancer. And as it becomes more and more complex, we can't underestimate the importance, because most screening occurs in primary care, of education and training programs for primary care docs and for patients so that they can make proper decisions. Thank you.
Of prevention, early detection, and how the underlying theme here, I think, for us is the importance of research and innovation so that we can deliver more for patients. We have time for some questions. It's a small room, so just stand up and introduce where you're from, and then I will repeat the question so that we can get it on the video. But feel free to direct your questions to any of our panelists, and you all have microphones here that work. So have at it. You have a great group of experts here you don't normally get. Go ahead. I'm not going to try to repeat that whole question, but the gist of the question is, and I'm going to turn to the medical experts here for a response. The question is about CML and research in terms of understanding resistance, understanding prevention and early detection opportunities, and understanding who will respond to which therapies. I don't know if I got all of that right, but go for it, our doctors.
I'm not a CML doc, but I do know a few of them. And you asked a range of questions. One, is there research looking at genetic predisposition to the disease? Two, is there research looking at the acquired in the cancer genetic or genomic reasons for loss of sensitivity to a drug? And one of the advantages of the leukemias over solid tumors, frankly, is that you can always draw blood. It's essentially a liquid biopsy that you can get all the time. And that's the reason that the leukemia docs have made faster progress in a lot of the biology than the solid tumor docs, although this is beginning to change. Research is being done on these areas. And in fact, I think the progress in terms of the liquid tumors is typically faster. One of the challenges is that a lot of the cancers are multiclonal, and you may survey enough of them at first to predict sensitivity to a targeted tyrosine kinase inhibitor like Gleevec, but you may miss the 0.5% of cells that actually were resistant, and that's what grows out later. That's a simplified version. But sensitive assays may overcome that in the years ahead. I mean, quite honestly, as difficult as it is to live with a chronic illness, that's the poster child for a very successful precision medicine advance in oncology right now.
Thank you. Other questions? Go ahead. So the question is about the long-term survivors and what type of research is being done to understand what their needs might be and what can be done to keep them healthy. I'm paraphrasing, but I don't know. I guess part of that is worrying about detecting or preventing secondary cancers and other types of follow-on side effects and other types of secondary cancers. So I don't know if our medical professionals want to take
So,
that on, or if
yeah,
that's something also that the
that's a
NCI is
very-
looking at as well.
Very hot topic for good reason, survivorship. It also comes at a time where there's never been more. What I mean is I think we're running between 14 and 17 million survivors in the years ahead. Their health problems are generally the same as their age-matched population, with the additional burden of toxicities from treatment plus the risk in some cases for second cancers. And I think this is where big data is going to turn out to be most useful. Most of these folks are not on clinical trials in a conventional sense, but as we have big data projects like ASCO's Cancer Link and others to start to draw in routine records to start to see how these folks do, I think we may gain some insights. And right now it's not a void exactly, but we don't know as much about that large and growing cohort as we could.
So I have a question, which has to do with resources. We hear a lot about precision medicine. Obviously, there's a great amount of energy in looking for better ways to treat and hopefully cure more cancers. But we also have heard today just how important the research side is in terms of prevention and early detection. I wonder, Bo, if you or maybe our friends from federal agencies, without getting in trouble, could talk a little bit about the constraint that we're living in terms of resources and what might be done? There you go.
There. I'd like to point out that prevention gets a very tiny fraction of the federal budget for any kind for research in general, prevention of all diseases. It's a single-digit allocation. So I would say anything we can do to increase the percentage, but we really need to increase the size of the pie so that if we get a bigger slice, it's a bigger slice of a bigger pie, and other areas are not losing. So what else did you?
No, that's good. I don't know if our
Okay.
federal agency colleagues are allowed to take that on, or.
I'm fortunate that we have equally knowledgeable colleagues sitting here, and I
Okay.
will just let them respond.
Okay. Well,
That's why you have advocates in the room, right?
I can
do,
I
yeah.
can add to that of wearing an advocate hat, and just to say I think it is very important that we are funding research across the board, and as important as it is to find innovative treatments for patients who have advanced metastatic disease, it also is important to be researching in some of these exciting new areas and technologies that maybe are less well understood. Do we have maybe one more question? Okay, go ahead. Oh, we have two. All right, quickly, we'll take them both.
Dr. Schnell, I was wondering, the examples you gave of the women at different risks for breast cancer with the different options for screening, real world, do the insurance companies go along with paying for the different modalities?
So the question was for Dr. Schnall in terms of, in the real world, are the payers following suit in terms of covering the different screening modalities based on what the science is suggesting would be most appropriate?
So as good evidence comes forward for various of those arms, the answer is yes. So MRI in screening the highest risk women is generally reimbursed across the country. Most payers are now seeing the benefits of 3D mammography in multiple ways and starting to pay for 3D mammography. I think an area that there's a lot of flux is this area of women with radiographically dense breasts who seek supplemental screening. There's legislation in many states that require notification of those women and suggest they may want to seek supplemental screening. It's very variable of whether that screening is reimbursed or not.
Okay, and I think we had one more question, if you want to have the last word. So the question is about processed foods and whether there's been research in terms of the connection between that and more cancer diagnosis. I'm noticing that Dr. Hudas had to step out of the room. So I don't know, Dr. Schnall, if you have a comment on that.
Well, just that generally, as Dr. Hudd has pointed out, there's been a lot of work looking at obesity and obesity as a risk factor for cancer, and we've heard some of the biology behind that, but I think it's been known for some time through epidemiologic studies, and there's a lot of people looking at trying to do interventions and whether or not you can reverse those trends through interventions. And so I suppose thinking about processed foods as they impact obesity is where that would, be accounted for.
Okay, and on that happy thought, as we all look for some apples and some other fruit and vegetables to eat this afternoon, I'm just going to conclude the briefing by saying thank you again to our panel. Dr. Hudas actually had to catch a plane. He has to get back to New York, but we really appreciate him being here, and we really appreciate all of you being here. And as you can see, there are lots of exciting avenues in terms of research for prevention and early detection. Again, to reiterate what I said before about the importance of federal support for these programs across the board. These briefings are really designed to hit topics that are most important to our friends and colleagues on the Hill and within the stakeholder organizations. So if you have ideas for future briefing topics, please let Mark or me know. And then I do want to thank our Cancer 101 briefing series sponsors. They are very important to allowing us to continue these programs to actually offer some kind of food and be able to videotape them. And so I would like to thank Amgen, Bristol Myers Squibb, Celgene, Genentech, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Novartis Oncology, Onyx Pharmaceuticals, Pfizer, and Pharma for their generous ongoing support for this program. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. I'm just giving you back 5 minutes of your day. Thank you.